If you look at some of the more optimistic stuff, and there is optimistic stuff, there's quite a bit going on in terms of business investment. Cash flow is up. Investment in capital equipment is up. You're seeing a lot of companies preparing for a better 2013. Depends a little on fiscal cliff, depends a little on what happens in Europe, depends on a lot of things, but the majority of the companies that I deal with in the manufacturing sector are gearing up. They're noticing that consumers are spending. And as soon as that becomes more common, they're prepared. They don't want to be the last one to market. So there's always this anticipation of growth. 2013 at this point, barring something bizarre, is probably going to be 2%, 2.5% growth. Nothing to write home about, but it's certainly not recession. And got to grow faster than this, got to be up around 3.5%, 4% to really make a lot of progress. But if we can get to 2.5, we're at least treading water. Here's the federal debt. This is the cause your indigestion slide. The cool thing about this is, or I guess cool is probably not the right word, disturbing maybe. The part that should really irritate you is not the last 2 or 3 months or years, because that's when you would expect a deficit to grow. That's recession, we're spending money, we're not making any. The part that's bothering people was the fact that we didn't make any progress on it during the boom years. That would have been the time to do something. I mean, the economy was growing, everybody was working, but we kind of said, hey, it's a party, I don't want to be the buzzkill. So we just kept adding to the federal debt. This is predominantly being done by the Fed. The Fed now has a balance sheet that is making bankers' eyes cross. It's gone from $800 billion to $3.3 trillion in 4 years. They've bought a lot of securities, and there's a huge debate going on between members within the Fed. There was a kind of a point-counterpoint between Bill Dudley of the New York Fed and Charles Plosser of the Philadelphia Fed, talking about how they plan to unwind from this. And Dudley is, oh, don't worry about it. You know, we're going to hike up those interest rates, and the banks will keep all their money just where it is. And the banks are like, no, we're not. We have a lot of customers that would sure like to have some access to credit. And as soon as we get an opportunity, we're going to start loaning. And there's not a lot that you can do with interest rates to keep us locked into this. Dudley's also assuming that we can sell off those bonds in an orderly manner. Really? You know, I mean, it's just kind of like, well, sure, the stock market is orderly and predictable. I know, no, it won't be. So that's going to be an issue, not too far down the road. You've got state debt. Illinois knows all about state debt. It's kind of like, really? So cheer up, California's worse, so you don't always have to hang your head in shame. I want to point out that Arkansas has the same color as Montana and North Dakota, both of whom have legitimate state budget surpluses. Arkansas refused to release any data. So Arkansas is basically like, it ain't good here, go away. So by all accounts, you're probably in much better shape. I mean, states have relied on government largesse from the federal level. It isn't coming, it isn't going to come for a while, and states are just going to have to figure out a way to deal with decisions made in the past. Again, just like the federal government, those pension provisions seemed to make a lot of sense back in the 70s and 80s, mostly because the people who were passing these knew they were going to be out of office long before the bill came due. Consumer confidence always looks like an EKG. We tend to be very fickle 1 month to the next, and we react to very strange things. The most consistent reaction in terms of extremes is to gas pricing. We now refer to gas pricing as the Kim Kardashian of economics. No one really understands why Kim is famous. She just is. She doesn't sing, she doesn't dance, she's just Kim. And no one really understands why gas prices make us so crazy. Because in the great scheme of things, it's not really what's moving the most, even within our household budgets. Anybody who's got a kid going to college knows all about inflation right now. But a nickel's change will either make us euphoric or depressed. I mean, I was talking to a guy on the radio this morning before I got here, doing a whole big thing because gas prices in Kansas City fell into the 340s. Wow, isn't this great? It's $3.40 a gallon, you twit. You know, a year or so ago, it was in the twos. You know, it's like, why are you getting exciting? It's like, well, I don't hurt as much as I did yesterday. It's like, you know, but people get nuts. And you see these wild gyrations of consumer confidence that is almost always connected to a shift in gas pricing. And it's partly because we see it. Everything else is kind of hidden. I mean, unless you go buy milk every day and pay attention to it, you don't know what milk prices are really. But gas pricing you can't miss. It's on every corner, and you see it. Housing has started to make a bit of a comeback. I mentioned that earlier. Part of what's happening on the housing side was predictable. You've had a decline in the number of available foreclosures. So if people are out looking for that bargain foreclosed home, there are fewer of them. So they now have to turn back to the traditional existing home market. There's not as much mobility in the economy right now. So a lot of existing homes are not available and would have been maybe 10 years ago. And that, by the way, is kind of helping make the employment situation complex. Back in the 80s, when we had high unemployment, it was a very different world, and the vast majority of us were in single wage earner dominated households. So if you lost your job, the drill was the guy came home, looked for a new job, showed up one day and says, "Hey honey, found a job in Phoenix," and pack up the kids and off you move to the Southwest. Fast forward to today, most of us are in dual wage earner households. So the guy comes home and says, "Hey honey, found a job in Minot." And she's like, "Good luck with that. I've got a better job than you, I've got a better benefit package than you, and I ain't raising frozen kidsicles." Can't move. Back in the 80s, the vast majority of people looking for new work were renters, or they could at least sell their home. What do you do now? You get a job in Minot, rent is $4,500 a month, and you're underwater on your mortgage. Yeehaw. Now what do? You can't move. You're stuck. And then I was talking to recruiters up there one day, and they said the number 2 reason that people weren't taking jobs up in this part of the country, despite the pay, and bear in mind that if you're a certified welder, you can get a job in North Dakota that pays $125,000 a year, and you get a $75,000 signing bonus. So the new 6-figure job is a welder. They couldn't move because of child custody issues. If they leave where they're living, they can't see their kids. So that's the end of that movement. Well, all of that has kind of combined to make existing home sales sluggish. And now that's been good news for the new home builders because they've got a bigger market than they've had. We've now seen growth. It was 35% higher than September of last year. So you've seen a pretty dramatic, at least beginning to a housing recovery. Foreign trade has declined. China is slow. Europe is slow. The reason that we worry about Europe is that it's a trade partner. 25% of our exports, 25% of our imports are European connected. And you can see it play out in the U.S. because when the Fed starts to release its manufacturing data, the East Coast looks much worse than the Midwest and much worse than the West. Those markets are pointed in different directions. If you're a manufacturer pointing south and you're working towards Mexico and Brazil and Colombia, you're doing fine. Those economies are booming. If you're pointed towards Europe, it's like, oops, there's no buying over there. I mean, it is an entire continent in crisis. Even the Germans are now worried about slipping into a recession for a quarter or two. You get to the West Coast, you're pointing towards Asia, which isn't doing as well as it used to, but at least it's better than Europe. I kind of point this out because we forget in all the discussion that China was not always powerful. This really began to start in the 90s. This is only about a 20-year-old phenomenon. And we also sort of assume that somehow Japan has fallen off the face of the earth. It hasn't. It's still the 3rd largest economy. But Japan has been sort of stalled for a number of years, and part of the reason is that they have a debt situation much worse than ours. And that's the real danger of debt. We have a debt that's 110% of our GDP. Japan's is 260% of its GDP. They are seriously in debt, and it just compromises them. They can't really react. So when China does something, there's no response back from Japan. We kind of get into that as we keep carrying this debt. I mean, right now, a lot of that debt is owned by the Chinese, $1.3 trillion. We still own the vast majority of our own debt. They can't single-handedly destroy the U.S. economy, but we've lost leverage. Because if we start to poke at the Chinese saying, we're going to make you do something, they're going to go, no, you're not, because we're going to undercut your dollar. And it's like, but wouldn't that hurt you? Yeah, but it'll hurt you more. So the two of us are just kind of like, those of you who have brothers know this drill. You know, it's kind of like, I'm going to smack you. Well, I'm going to smack you back. Well, I'm bigger, but I'll hurt you more. You know, and this is kind of where you're at. You're stuck in a very awkward dance because we don't have the leverage that we would like to have with a country like that. Food prices have spiked a little. They will probably spike a bit more next year, particularly meat. We kind of got through this year because the farmers had good wheat crops and all of that stuff. The group that really got nailed were livestock feeders because it's expensive. Most of the farmers, most of the ranchers have been feeding their cattle hay all summer and fall, and you don't normally do that. So they're selling off their herds, massive slaughters. Something like a third of all the cattle in the U.S. have been taken to slaughter this year. So beef prices have been pretty reasonable of late. That will not be the case in the spring. The fastest growing appliance sale in the U.S. today is a freezer. People are anticipating the spring when they'll have to get a bank loan to buy T-bones. This could be a whole new thing. You know, it's like you can just have a little display set up next to the butcher's counter and say, you know, thinking of a weekend? One of the ways that we track inflation is with metal prices, and metal prices have generally been down. Copper, aluminum, steel, you name it. Steel has been bouncing around a little bit because the car industry has been going through kind of an interesting period, and cars matter a lot for this part of the country, as they do in Kansas City. One of the more bizarre things in the auto sector, the single most American car you can own in terms of parts and labor and everything else is a Toyota Camry from Kentucky. It is now being shipped to Japan because it is cheaper to make it here than it is to make it in Japan. So we are now making a Japanese car and selling it to Japan. It's kind of like, who would have thought in the 70s that that would be happening? So we have a interesting challenge when it comes to cars. The average age of an American car is as old as it has ever been, 10.9 years. We now make them to last. Car makers are kind of like, what was wrong with, you know, planned obsolescence? You know, we got to sell you a new car every 3 years. So now they'll last forever, and the saturation in the U.S. market is extreme. For every 10 people, and this includes children and people in prison, there are 9.3 cars. So there is no more space. In China, it's 3 out of every 10, and that's why you see a lot more activity there. GM has 65,000 employees making cars in the United States. They have 75,000 in China. So GM is more a Chinese company now than an American company in terms of employment. So at some point we have to figure out what to do to kind of restart the car market, find other ways for people to add cars, you know, start selling them in 6-packs or something. But beyond some of that, you've got the challenge that banks have been facing, which is the only thing that they could really do for a while was to make car loans. And it got easier and easier and easier. And one of the challenges is that a certain category of banks, present company excluded, got as aggressive with car loans as they got with bank mortgage loans a few years ago. And it got to the point that people could walk in and if they made $200 a week, they could get a loan to buy a car. Now all of a sudden the repo numbers are growing, and it's kind of like, gee, there's a bunch of banks in California and Nevada that are suddenly wow, we own like 1,000 cars. That's not really what we had planned, so that will become an issue. As long as construction is down, as long as you don't have a lot of growth in some of the metal-oriented industries, metal prices will stay down. That's one of the better signs of inflation. When those start to come back up, that's when everything starts to get more expensive, because it's kind of at the core of almost everything in the U.S. So when you start, and I know you wake up every day and run to the paper and say, gosh, what are aluminum futures doing? But if you are one of those weird people, you can now track it. I think that was the last one. Oh, no, one more last comment. This is the Credit Managers Index. It was mentioned that I'm the economist for the National Association for Credit Management. Credit managers are akin to bankers. These are the people within an organization whose job it is to calm down the salespeople. Salespeople come back and they have all this good stuff, and the credit manager says, it's not a sale until we're paid. And they're the green eye shade crowd. So we track credit managers, and we look at things like bankruptcies, dollars exposed, accounts out for collection, disputes, number of credit apps granted, number of credit apps accepted, sales, all that stuff. And every month we get kind of a read as to how the credit managers are faring in the economy as a whole. What we've noticed over the years is that when we get a movement in our index, the purchasing managers index moves the next month, because credit managers kind of think in the future. They're not all that concerned about today. They're concerned when their invoices are due. So what are you going to be like in 90 days when you owe me money? So we started to see some interesting improvement. And the good news with either the PMI or the CMI, anything over 50 is expansion in the economy. Anything under 50 is contraction. The good news is we've been over 50 for literally over a year and a half. The bad news is we haven't been a lot over 50. I characterize this as not champagne cork popping time, this is wine box opening time. It will get better, presumably, but it's taking its sweet time. There have been days and years when we've been up in the 70s, but again, in 2009 and 2010, we were in the 30s and 40s, which was clearly contractionary. So, all in all, next year will be marginally better than this one. It's kind of like, it's the kind of just riotous good news where the doctor comes in and says, well, the good news, you're not dead. The bad news is you're closer than, you know, it's kind of like, yay. So they don't call us the dismal science for nothing. You know, we're not really allowed to be excited. And there's rarely much to be excited about, so it's pretty easy to take that position. The elections will have an impact, but it's kind of different from the way the press presents it. A lot of contests focus on the presidency itself. You know, what'll happen if Romney wins? What'll happen if Obama wins? When it comes to the economy, not much. Presidents don't do much with the economy. You wouldn't know that to listen to the debates, but they're getting up and saying, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And it's like, well, you know what? Anything having to do with taxes and spending, well, that's Congress. Presidents are not allowed to do that. That's Congress. Presidents can stand off to the sideline and say, I think you ought to do this. And Congress can say, shut up. You know, not your job. Monetary policy, stuff that affects the banks. I mean, the banks are not sitting around going, gosh, I wonder if Romney or Obama is going to win. Ben Bernanke controls their world, and it's what the Fed does. And if there is a role for the president, which there will be, next year is Ben Bernanke's last year. He's indicated he does not want to be Fed chair anymore, and everybody on the planet has indicated that they don't want him to be the Fed chair anymore. So one of the things I'd love to query the candidates is, like, who do you have in mind? Because the two names that are circulating for Obama are Janet Yellen, who's the current vice chair, and Larry Summers, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Both of them are real loose money fans, so they would continue current policies, probably add even more to the balance sheet, etc. The two names that are floating around for Romney are Glenn Hubbard and Martin Feldstein, who are both like the second coming of Paul Volcker. And if you remember Volcker back in the 80s, it's like, I'm going to raise interest rates, deal with it, and it's just like, ugh, a good mortgage was 22%. And it's just like, I remember people saying, wow, I got a great deal, it's only 21.9. It's just like, how can you survive? But different era. So when it comes right down to it, the real message for the election is who wins in Congress, who controls the Senate. Traditionally, the most effective the government ever is, and this is frightening, is when the president is one party and Congress is the other, because then they cancel each other out unless they figure out a way to cooperate. And that brings the moderates out on both sides because they have no choice. Otherwise, you have 2 to 4 years of absolutely nothing but one party passing something that the president vetoes, and then the president suggests something, and the other party throws things at him, and it just, and after a while, the entire population just goes nuts. Right now, Congress has a 7% approval rate, lowest in history. There is actually a movement on the internet, you can find it, apologizing to Great Britain and asking for the king back. So, there are options. I'm going to shut up now. I think I've already gone past my time, but if there's time for questions, I'll be glad to take a couple. I've stunned you into silence. No, okay.
You talked about that. Could you address inflation with this quantitative easing and how you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big questions, particularly among economists, is what do you get with round after round after round of quantitative easing? The notion behind quantitative easing is trying to keep long-term interest rates low by basically buying up government debt as fast as you can. You create money. I mean, the Fed is pumping money into the Treasury by buying these securities. It is inflationary, and at some point you have to unwind. And when you unwind, you're either going to do it in a mad rush, which is going to thrust the economy back into a recession, or you don't do it fast enough, and inflation begins to mount. The people who are in the Fed right now that are most concerned about inflation have been sounding the alarm for quite a while. Kansas City and St. Louis both have inflation hawks at their Fed. Now, the Kansas City is legendary for its inflation hawk. Tom Honig set the record for number of consecutive dissents on interest rate decisions, and it was really funny to read the Fed minutes because no matter what they were talking about, Tom Honig, you've got to raise interest rates and you've got to raise it. Tom, we're ordering sandwiches now. Yeah, but you've got to raise interest rates. And he retired and has been replaced by Esther George. And Esther is this beautiful, charming, diminutive woman. When you get her on the subject of inflation, she becomes the screaming banshee of, she is not happy. But neither is James Bullard from St. Louis, or Richard Fisher from Dallas, or Plosser from Philadelphia, or Lacker from Richmond. So the feeling is that this probably is the last QE, no matter what Bernanke says, because his term's coming to an end. And the inflation hawks will be in a better position next year. There'll be more of them on the Fed's Open Market Committee. Theoretically, we can get out of this with minimal damage, but if there's any sort of stampede mentality, we're going to be facing a crisis. And the problem is we almost always get stampede mentality. The mortgage-backed securities were a classic example. Those things were designed to be solid if 10% of the mortgages went south. But when things got bad, people assumed that they were much worse than that, and before they even checked them out, they were bailing out of these things like they were on fire. Now that the Fed has bought most of these, and they're tearing them apart, 10% failure rate. Just what was predicted. But it's just like screaming fire in a crowded room. I mean, if somebody starts yelling fire, are you going to sit there and say, where? And start looking around for it? Hell no. You're going to head for the door and throw people to the side. That's human nature. If you think mortgage-backed securities have gone south, well, you dump them. You're not going to sit there and say, well, I don't think they're as bad as they look. And it's like, well, good for you. The rest of us sold it, and yours is now worthless. So it's going to be interesting to watch how the Fed negotiates, and by about the middle of next year, it's all going to be focused on who the next guy is and what their policies are going to be. So I know it's not as gripping as presidential debates, but watching the arguments over potential, if nothing else, the hearings are as turgid as they come, because it's everyone speaking as economists trying to confuse the senators, which is not really that hard. But it gets, even economists are going. So, anything else? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's a very good question. We could go on for days on that one. The Affordable Health Care Act has all kinds of foreseen and unforeseen implications. The biggest problem that people have not really come to grips with is how it changes the relationship between a business and its employees. The assumption is that if you have a company under 50, you don't have to worry about this because the fines won't apply to you, blah, blah, blah. The reality is small companies have to come up with benefit packages of some kind. Otherwise, they lose their workers. They are competing with companies that want to poach them. And if you're working for a company that has no health plan, no benefit packages, all it does is pay you, and somebody comes along and says, I'm going to pay you a little bit more and give you a little benefit package, you're gone. And the little guys are saying, well, you may think it doesn't apply to us, but it does. We're going to have to come up with some kind of health care plan. And given that the insurance companies know what our fines are going to be, the plans that they will offer will be $1 less than the fine. So if you're going to be fined $1,500 for every employee that's not covered, well, how amazing. If you buy an insurance plan, you're only going to be paying $1,499. I mean, it's just like, oh, hey, that's a saving of $1 a person. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be complicated. It's going to make workers, I mean, in some respects, it's great for the workers. They have a mobile health plan. They can go wherever they want. But that creates havoc for the business. They don't have the ability to hang on to their trained individuals. Germany, for example, has very elaborate training, all of that stuff. Companies do a lot of training. The difference between the Germans and us is that if you agree to take a job with a German company and they train you, you sign a contract that says you belong to them for 20 years. After 20 years, you can go find some other employee. But we trained you, we own you. You know, in the United States, it's like, hey, we trained you. And I call it the Kansas City Royals syndrome. We let our players reach puberty and we sell them to the Yankees. We can't keep them because there's somebody always poaching and offering more money. And the Health Care Act becomes part of that. And then just the fact that the taxes to pay for it will be going up. Just kind of one note on taxes. This is one of the reasons that economists don't become global leaders. One of the weird things that all economists agree on, left, right, and center, is that corporate taxes are stupid. Corporate taxes are never paid by corporations. They are paid by the customers of the corporation. It's a cost of doing business, so it gets passed on to whoever buys the product. You don't want to tax the profits the corporation makes. You want to tax the people that are getting rich from working from the corporation. So if you want money, tax the people who are making money. Don't tax the company, because you're kind of rewarding the wrong thing. You're taxing the company, and then you don't tax, because of different tax loopholes, the people who are making money, which is kind of dumb. And small businesses, particularly today, need every dime they can get. National Federation for Independent Business actually has been doing a study for years, which has said that how much of time does an individual spend on their own business? And back in the 70s, it was about 85% of your time was spent running your own business. Today, that percentage is 42%. 60% of the time a business owner spends is on regulations, taxes, paperwork. And I mean, banks are facing this. I was talking to a bank conference the other day, and they said this regulator was like, well, aren't you excited? You guys have been hiring all these new people. And the bank says, I'm hiring compliance officers. Well, yeah, you're hiring people. They're not producing anything. You have asked me to hire a bureaucrat to work with your bureaucrats. I want to hire a loan officer. I want to hire a salesperson. I don't want to hire a compliance officer. I need them because the Dodd-Frank thing added 500 new banking regulations from 27 different banking-related agencies. So if you want to know, he used to be taller and had darker hair. So it has simply been the burden of the job. Probably take one more and then they'll throw us out of here physically. And this is Brian Webster's phone, in case anybody wanted to know.
Why is a value-added tax a lousy idea?
I don't know that it is a lousy idea. The Europeans have done it for a long time, and part of the challenge that we're facing is we have a weird tax system, probably the weirdest on the planet, because most countries have begun to move away from income tax because an income tax basically penalizes working hard. I mean, the more you make, the more you get taxed, so after a while, there's not a lot of incentive to make any more money. Most countries have sort of adopted the German model. The Germans began to switch over to combinations of consumption taxes and value-added taxes, particularly consumption tax, and it's had unexpected benefits. When they decided to, it's almost a 50% tax on the most expensive Mercedes. And everyone said, well, that'll kill that market. Sales went up. You're not buying a $100,000 car for transportation. You're buying a car that expensive because you're showing off. And so now Fritz can say, I am so rich, I can afford the car. It's the Texas. You know, it's like, you know, how important am I? So you basically tax the toys, and you know, taxes are virtually non-existent in Germany on food and on medicine, and housing is subsidized. But by God, if you want to buy a yacht, half the price of that sucker is going to be taxes. But surprise, people don't give up things they want. I mean, I used to be a salesman in high school, and I learned the trick early. Once somebody has the product in their hand, I mean, it would be my whole approach to get them to hold it. Because as soon as they were holding it, I would try to take it back. Sale was done. Can't take that away from me, because I would be saying things like, well, I'm sorry I gave you that. It's probably a little out of your price range, isn't it? It is not. It's like ka-ching. I mean, that's how that works. So I think a value-added tax would work, but it would have to replace the income tax. You couldn't have both, because then you would be just nailing people to the wall. Even Sweden backed off. Sweden has reduced taxes over the last 10 years and has dumped $93 billion back into the Swedish economy. And surprise, Sweden's growing at 6%. So if you're getting the impression that I'm kind of a conservative economist, that's probably accurate. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for inviting me to Edwardsville.
Thank you, Dr. Kuehl. Outstanding work in disproving another myth that economists can't have personalities, right? You're not going to tell me that you're a CPA as well, are you? Okay.
No.
Well, like all of us intellectually know, the data are one thing, and then you have to take action. And I think in general what you heard was a trending, fairly positive report. We'll keep you updated on that, but what you need to do, though, is look at your own portfolios, where you're headed financially, and work within that. So my cheap plug is there's a lot of folks in this room that would be glad to help you and work with you to build your portfolio, get you where you need to be financially. That's what we do, and we'd appreciate that as well.